This is Chapter 1, Part A, Evolution, the Themes of Biology, and Scientific Inquiry. So in this chapter, we'll just do kind of a broad introduction to biology and different aspects and themes of biology, as well as some evolution and scientific principles. So biology is defined as scientific study of life. So typically, ology at the end of the word means the study of, and bio means life or living things. So the study of life or living things. So when we study biology, we see there are 5 unifying themes. The 5 unifying themes in biology are organization, information, energy and matter, interactions, and evolution. So organization could be from the molecular level, so the structure of the proteins or the molecules, to the cellular level, so the organization of how the cells are arranged that make up a tissue, the organization and structure of the tissue that make up an organ, and different organs that are organized to sustain an organism. Information is in the genetic information encoded in our DNA and how that translates into this structure and organization that we see in living things. Energy and matter, or the flow of energy throughout ecosystems, food webs, so energy from the sun that is then transformed by plants and can be harvested by animals that then eat those plants. So it's the same source of energy, original source of energy from the sun that's going to flow throughout these different levels in the ecosystems. Interactions between different organisms, such as predator and prey interactions. And then evolution. So how do we explain the vast diversity between different organisms and species that we see today? So all living things have some shared characteristics of life or some properties that we see in all living things. So even from a simple single-celled bacteria up into a complex organism such as humans. So the first is order. So life is characterized by highly ordered structure. So we talked about the organization. So even from the molecular level, building up, we have this defined structure and organization that characterizes living things. All living things are the product of evolutionary adaptations. So the modern species and organisms that we see today have been evolving for millions of years and are the product of the reproductive success of their ancestors. So all species are kind of uniquely adapted to their particular environments. Another property of life is regulation, right, or basically homeostasis. So organisms, living things, even single cells have to be able to maintain kind of constant internal conditions despite fluctuating and changing external environmental conditions. So in this example, the jackrabbit has these large ears with blood vessels to help regulate its body temperature, right? Despite fluctuations in the atmospheric temperature in the surrounding air. Energy processing, so all living things have to obtain and use energy. Plants use energy from the sunlight to make sugar that they can then use that chemical energy to power other processes and growth. Other animals will have to obtain energy from other organisms, so they either eat plants or other animals. So in this example, the butterfly is going to use the chemical energy that's been stored by the plant from the sun to use in its metabolism to power its life functions. All living things must be able to undergo growth and development. So the genetic information in their DNA is going to kind of control and regulate their pattern of growth and development of these different organisms. So typically when you think of growth and development, you think of a plant or an animal getting bigger in size. But single-celled organisms like bacteria, when we talk about bacterial growth, we're talking about the number of cells in that bacterial colony. Living things must be able to sense and respond to stimuli in their environment. Right? So we need to be able to detect what's going on around us and be able to respond to that. So we humans, right, we have our special senses. We have our eyes to see, ears to hear, right? We can taste, smell, touch. Right? We're able to detect things around us, both inside and outside of our bodies. In this example, the Venus flytrap is going to respond to the stimulus of an insect, right, landing on the trap. So it's able to respond by closing and able to obtain that energy. And then finally, reproduction. All living things have to be able to reproduce, right, to propagate the species, to continue their genetic lineage. Organisms, living things, have to be able to reproduce their own kind, right? Otherwise, it would be an evolutionary dead end. It's kind of the underlying goal of biology and living things is to pass on your genetic information. So when studying biology and life, there are different levels that we can focus on or look at, depending on kind of how broad or narrow you want your focus to be. So we can look at the molecular level, kind of the base level that kind of builds everything from the molecular chemical level all the way up to the biosphere. So the entire planet, all the ecosystems, all the living and non-living components on the earth. So in order to kind of make this more manageable and easier to kind of comprehend, biologists typically use the reductionism approach. So we just break down these complex systems into their more simple, basic components. So it's just more manageable and easier to digest this information. The saying the easiest way to eat an elephant, right, is one bite at a time. So we break it down into the smaller components so it's easier to kind of grasp these different levels. So we can look at kind of the most basic molecular level, so the structure of the molecules that are going to make up the organelles or the parts of a cell. So this would be a chloroplast, right? So this could be, say, the chlorophyll molecule in a chloroplast of a plant cell. So then we have many cells kind of working together to form our plant tissue, right? And then the tissues in the plant are going to form the organs, right? Or the leaves. Right? So plants have different organs just like we do. So we have organs like our skin, like our stomach, our heart, that all work together to keep us alive. So plants have their leaves, they have their flowers to form the organisms. We look at the whole organism together. And then if we want to build from there, we can go up to the next level of population. So population is just kind of all of the same type of organism living together, right? So our human population, right? Or this is a population of the purple flowers. So then if we want to increase complexity, we can look at communities. So now we have multiple species kind of living in the same area. So we have purple flowers, white flowers, orange flowers, and some deer, some animal species that are all living in this community. And then ecosystems are going to factor in the non-living kind of earth components. So we have all the flowers and the animals as well as the mountain regions that influence their habitat, maybe the type of soil in the region, right? All comprise the ecosystem. And then there are different ecosystems all around the world. So you can have tundras, you have deserts, you can have prairies, you have forests, right? But all those together are going to make up our biosphere, the entire Earth, living and non-living components of the Earth. Emergent properties are going to emerge or result from the arrangement and interaction of the individual components or parts as our complexity of a structure increases. So in this example, we can have the individual parts of a cell kind of all separate. So say the molecules that make up the cell, you have the phospholipids that are going to make up the membrane, you have some of the separate individual organelles, but on their own, individually, they're not going to do anything, right? It's not until the individual parts are arranged in an organized structure that now the emergent properties or the emergent behavior is going to result or appear. Right? So once we put all these cell components together, now the cell can carry out life functions. Emergent properties can also be characterized for non-biological subjects as well. So classic example is a bicycle. A functioning bicycle you're able to sit on, right, pedal and ride, it rolls, right, you can use it. However, all of the individual parts and components have to be assembled, right, in an organized structure for that to happen. So you can have the wheels, the seat, the frame, the handlebars, the brakes, the pedals, the chain, all separate, but individually, right, they're not going to function. It's not until they are connected in the correct way, right, that then those emergent properties are going to appear. So this reductionist approach to biology, we can study kind of the individual components or the isolated components of the living system to make it a bit easier to kind of break down and comprehend. So in some branches of biology, we can complement this reductionist approach with what's called systems biology, where we focus just on particular organ systems or structural levels of organization. So for instance, in my anatomy and physiology class, when we're looking at different organ systems, we always kind of start with the tissue, the histology level. So we look at the function, the structure and the function of the cardiac, the heart and muscle tissue itself. So the shape of these cells in the tissue are going to kind of influence their function in contracting in the heart. Then we can look at the heart organ itself. Right, so the heart will have the 4 chambers, and how they're arranged, how the blood is going to flow through the heart in a particular way, right, in one direction only. But it's a result, right, of its smaller structure. So everything kind of is going to be going back to those lower levels, right? So the reductionist approach, so looking at kind of the most simple level and building up from there. And then we can look at the organ system. So in the heart, it's part of the cardiovascular system with the blood vessels. So we can look at how the heart pumps the blood and how it travels through the body and interacts with the tissues and functions in gas exchange. And then we can look kind of at the whole picture, the whole organ level, organism level, multicellular organism. So the cardiovascular system is not going to be an isolated system. So it's going to work kind of in conjunction with the respiratory system, right? So with the immune system, with the lymphatic system, with the digestive system. So they're all working together to kind of maintain life and keep us functioning and alive. So probably one of the most important underlying themes in all of biology that we will keep touching on is the correlation between structure and function. So at each level of that biological hierarchy, we find this correlation between structure and function. So basically, the structure of an organ or a tissue or a cell or a body part is going to dictate what function it's able to carry out. And conversely, if we know the function of something, we can kind of look backwards and have insight into its structure and how it may be organized. This is going to hold true even down to the molecular and the cellular level. Okay? So molecular shape and function is also going to be reflective of how these atoms are going to bond and interact with each other. So the shape determines how molecules can interact with other molecules and their function. So in this example, this is the molecular structure of an endorphin, or naturally produced endorphins by the central nervous system. And this is the molecular shape of morphine, which is kind of a synthetic man-made endorphin chemical. So this portion of the molecule is going to bind to our receptors in our brain cells. So it's kind of like a lock and key mechanism. So you got to have the right shaped key to fit in this particular lock. Right? So because they are structurally similar, they're both able to fit in these receptors and induce kind of the same function. So even at the cellular level, so the shape of a cell can determine its function. Right? So Nerve cells are going to generate and conduct impulses, electrical impulses. So we have these shorter branching dendrites to receive electrical signals from other neurons, and we have the long projections, the axons, that are going to send those signals to other distant neurons. So we can send and receive messages over these long distances. Another classic example are red blood cells. So a standard red blood cell has kind of this biconcave disc shape that's going to provide its function in gas exchange. Right? So it has a large surface area to carry the oxygen molecules and the round shape. Right? It can travel smoothly through the blood vessels. Well, if the hemoglobin molecule that's kind of making up the red blood cell, it's inside the red blood cell, is abnormally shaped, that's going to have downstream effects and make the cell itself abnormally shaped. So now the function is compromised. So now the blood cells can't carry oxygen as efficiently, and they're more prone to getting kind of stuck or trapped in these smaller blood vessels because of that abnormal shape. So continuing up the hierarchy, so even kind of limb structure, right, can determine function. So a whale's flipper, right, is a different structure than a bat's wing because they have different functions. So the shape and structure of the wing allows the bat to fly, whereas the shape and structure of the flipper of the whale allows it to more easily paddle and swim through the water. So I said that we could study life from multiple levels all the way down to like the chemical and molecular level. However, technically the only living level for study is the cellular level. So the cell is considered the smallest unit of structural organization that can carry out all of those life properties, those shared characteristics and activities required for life. So cell theory is another kind of underlying theme in biology, which states that all living organisms are made up of at least one cell, one or more cells. All cells must come from pre-existing cells, so we don't have just a spontaneous generation of life from non-life, and that the cell is just the basic unit of structural organization that can carry out all of those life functions. So there are different types of cells, but they do share some common characteristics. So all cells are going to have a membrane that's going to form a barrier to kind of separate the internal cell contents from the outside environment and regulate what can come in and out of the cell. There are two main types of cells that we'll look at. So bacteria and archaea, so kind of the more primitive, more simple type organisms are going to be considered prokaryotic. Single-celled organisms, just meaning they don't have a nucleus. They're not as structurally complex as other types of life. So all other forms of life, so plants, animals, are composed of eukaryotic cells, meaning that they have a nucleus and they have these little organs or organelles to carry out specific functions. So a eukaryotic cell, U as in for true nucleus. So the genetic material is going to be enclosed and protected inside this membrane-bound nucleus. And it also has some specialized membrane-bound organelles to carry out specific functions. So they're kind of like little organs in the cells, much like our own organs. So our stomach has a specific function for digestion, right? Our lungs have specific function for gas exchange, right? So these organelles have specific functions to help the cell carry out its life properties. So then by comparison, a prokaryotic cell is more primitive, more simple in structure. They're only single-celled organisms like bacteria and much smaller. They don't have a nucleus. They do still have a membrane, right, and genetic material, but instead of their DNA being kind of enclosed and protected and isolated, it's just kind of freely floating in the cell. So all cells, prokaryotic and eukaryotic, still contain chromosomes of genetic material in the form of DNA. Right, so DNA, we said, was going to carry that genetic information that kind of is the blueprint or instructions for how to make all organisms, right? So how it's going to dictate how they grow and develop. So DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. So in a eukaryotic cell, we said the DNA is enclosed in the nucleus in our chromosomes, right? So each chromosome is going to contain a very long DNA molecule with up to hundreds of thousands of genes that's very tightly packed into these compact kind of X-shaped chromosomes. So the DNA itself is kind of this double helix twisted ladder. So a gene is just one specific region of the DNA molecule that codes for one specific protein. So the DNA will wrap around these little proteins and just kind of compact it down and coil it up into these chromosomes so that we can package them nice and neatly in the nucleus of the cell. So again, the genetic information that's encoded in our DNA and our genes is going to basically be the blueprint instructions for how to grow and develop an organism. Right? So all of your physical traits, even some of your personality traits, are encoded in your DNA. During fertilization, you have sperm meets egg, right? So you have DNA from the father combines with DNA from the mother, right, for a fertilized egg. So now the cell will start to carry out the instructions encoded in that DNA. So now the result would be a new genetically unique individual or offspring that has traits or genes, DNA, inherited from both parents. So again, everything is based on the structure reflecting the function. So the function of DNA to store this genetic information is a result of its molecular structure. So DNA is made up of two chains that are typically arranged in a double helix, kind of a twisted ladder. Right? So we have two strands of DNA side by side. So all DNA from bacteria to plants, animals, humans is composed of the same four chemical building blocks called nucleotides. So the same four letters make up the genetic code for all life on Earth. So A, G, T, and C. So adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. So the genetic instructions, or kind of the message that's encoded in our DNA, is going to be embedded in the sequence of these four letters, right, for how to make a specific protein. So it's very much like an alphabet. Right? So how we have 26 letters in our alphabet. So depending on the sequence of those letters, how we arrange those 26 letters together, we can make over 400,000 different words. Okay? Then we could go even further and put different words together to make different sentences, right, to have different meanings, up all the way to complete books, paragraphs, and chapters, and books, just based on those original 26 letters. So our DNA works much the same way. So those four letters, A, T, C, and G, can code for 20 different amino acids. Amino acids are just the building blocks for proteins, but those 20 amino acids can make over 100,000 protein words. Okay? So this example, if we put together the letters C-A-T, right, that means cat. So it has a specific meaning. It codes for a certain word. Right? So same thing with these four nucleotides. If we put GGC together, that codes for a specific amino acid in proline. So everything, again, structure reflects function. So the structure of a protein is going to be based on which amino acids it's made up of. And the amino acids, which amino acids the protein is made up of, is going to be encoded by the DNA in the sequence or order of those letters. One of the central dogmas of biology is that DNA is going to be transcribed or copied into RNA and then translated into protein. Right? So how do we express the genes in our DNA? How do we go from that genetic information into a three-dimensional functioning protein? So the process of gene expression is just converting information from the gene to a cellular product. So it's much like baking a cake. So I like to bake, so I like to use the analogy of making a cake. So say you go to the library, right, to find a recipe. So all the instructions, all the recipes are in the DNA in this cookbook, right? And all of the books are in the library, right? They're in the nucleus. But in this particular library, they won't let you check out any books or take any books home. However, you can make a photocopy of a page and take that home with you. So we use RNA, right, to make a temporary transcript or copy of our gene sequence. Right, and then we can take the RNA, our photocopy of the recipe, out of the library and take it home to our kitchen. So in this example, the cytoplasm would be our kitchen outside of the library. So then we add our ingredients. So we're following the instructions in this RNA. So the RNA is basically just a temporary copy of the information, the letters, the sequence of the letters in the DNA. Right, so we go home and we translate this code, this ATCG code, and we add our amino acids to our ribosome mixing bowl. So a ribosome is just one of those organelles or those little cell organs. So its job is to translate the mRNA, messenger RNA, to determine which amino acids it needs to put in which order to make a protein. So then our finished product, right, is a three-dimensional functional product that we can use, right, or a cake that we can eat. Right? So basically, how do we go from letters on a page, right, in a book, to a real cake that we can eat, right, and enjoy? So how do we go from the letters in the DNA, encoded in the DNA, to a three-dimensional protein like hemoglobin in the blood cells? Right? So how do we know how to make regular hemoglobin and not the sickle cell abnormal hemoglobin? So we look at an organism's genome, we're talking about the entire genetic library or genetic instructions in that cell. There are different branches of biology. So genomics is the study of the whole set of genes in one or more species. So you may have heard of like the Human Genome Project, where they mapped out the entire genetic sequence in humans. Proteomics is kind of taking it a step further and then translating that genetic information into proteins. So now we're studying the whole set of proteins that a genome is able to code for. So we look at an entire set of proteins that are expressed by a cell or tissue and organ. It's called the proteome. So kind of genome is all of the genetic instructions. Genomics is the study of the genome. So the proteome is all of the proteins that we can produce. Proteomics is the study of those proteins. So modern genomics will depend on heavily on technology and computers that make it possible to kind of sequence and process all of this information. So we can have tens of thousands of genes and letters in a DNA sequence. So computers really help to make sense and process that information. So this high throughput technology can yield enormous amounts of data. And we use what's called bioinformatics to kind of use computer tools to process all of this genetic data relatively quickly. So if we were doing this by hand and counting all of these individual letters, it would be a huge amount of work, a huge undertaking. So this is considered to be interdisciplinary. So you can have computer scientists working with chemists and mathematicians, working with biologists, working with engineers, all kind of coming together, putting their brains together to process this complex information. So I said one of the requirements for life or properties of life was that transfer of energy. Right? So processing and flow of energy through a system. So all the energy in our ecosystems is going to originate from the sun, right? So plants, they are the producers. They're kind of the base level of this pyramid. So they're going to harness energy from the sun and convert it into a chemical energy of sugar in their own tissues and cells. So this chemical energy generated by plants and other photosynthetic organisms, things like algae, is then going to be able to be passed along to the consumers, right, to other organisms and animals. So animals aren't able to harness energy from the sun, right? But they are able to get energy from eating the plants. So consumers are just organisms that are going to feed on other organisms or their remains. So whenever an organism uses energy to perform work, so basically work could be it's moving, it's living, it's digesting. Any type of biological activity can be considered work, and it's going to require energy. Some of that energy is going to be lost as heat. Right, so just from normal metabolism. So our own bodies, we generate our metabolism, and our standard body heat, 98.6 degrees, is a result of burning, our cells burning that chemical energy to keep us alive and functioning. So as a result, the energy is going to flow throughout an ecosystem. So it originates as sunlight, and a lot of it is going to leave as heat. So we're not able to obtain 100% of the energy, the caloric energy, from these different levels. One of the laws of thermodynamics is that energy transfer is not 100% efficient. So a percentage of the energy as we transfer from one form to another is going to be lost to the environment as heat. So say the plants, the producers, are able to manufacture 10,000 calories of energy from the sunlight. Well, when the rabbit eats those plants, it's only going to be able to get 1,000 calories, right, or 10% of that energy from the plants, because the rest is going to be given off as heat. So then when the next level up, so when the predator snake eats the rabbit, he's only going to be able to get 10% of the rabbit's energy, so 100 calories. And then the eagle, right, the top predator, the apex predator at the top of the food chain, right, he's only going to be able to get 10% of that, so 10 calories. This is one reason why your top level predators generally have to eat more than, say, the herbivores or the primary consumers to meet their energy needs, because by the time they get to those prey items, a lot of the original energy has been lost to the environment. So chemicals can also cycle within an ecosystem where they're used up and then recycled. So everything reused and recycled in the environment. So when the top predator dies, when the eagle dies, right, its body and its nutrients in its body will decay and return those nutrients to the soil, which then the plants, the producers, can use in their own metabolism again. We said one other life function was regulation. So living things have to be able to maintain homeostasis and maintain kind of stable internal conditions despite things maybe fluctuating or changing around them. So many biological processes use this self-regulation through a mechanism called feedback. So in feedback regulation, the output or the end result of a process is used to regulate that process. So it's much like a thermostat in your house, right? So the thermostat, you set the thermostat to a certain temperature. So I set my thermostat to 72 degrees. So the air conditioner comes on, it blows cool air until the ambient air temperature reaches 72 degrees, right? The thermostat detects that we've reached the ideal temperature, and then it turns the air conditioner off, right? So we don't want to keep blowing cool air and get too cold, right? So that would be kind of an example of a feedback. So once we reach kind of the desired product or end result, then we can turn off that response. So the most common type of feedback would be a negative feedback. So this would be like the thermostat, where once we reach our desired goal or product, then we just turn off that response. So this example, we're looking at insulin production. Okay, so you eat a sugary meal, so it's going to raise your blood glucose, right? So the high level of sugar in the blood is going to stimulate your pancreas cells to release insulin to the blood. Insulin is going to cause your cells to take up the excess glucose and use it for their metabolism, right? So as a result, we lower our blood glucose levels back to our normal levels, right? So now the pancreas detects blood glucose is back where it should be. We don't need to release any more insulin, so we will turn off our insulin production. We don't want to over-secrete insulin and then have our blood sugar get too low. That could cause problems as well. So it's always trying to maintain this delicate balance and keep things in that homeostatic range. The opposite type of feedback is less common. It's only in a couple of processes, but it's called positive feedback. So instead of turning off the original response, we're going to speed up the production and kind of ramp up that response, kind of like a snowball effect. So one example would be for labor contractions. Oxytocin is a hormone that's going to induce labor contractions. It's kind of the love hormone as well, the bonding, also milk production. So oxytocin stimulates labor contractions. Those contractions are going to cause release prostaglandins, which are kind of alarm chemicals or chemical signals from the cells. So those prostaglandins are going to trigger release of more oxytocin. So then the brain is going to stimulate secretion of more oxytocin, right? And the cycle just kind of intensifies. So once those labor contractions begin, we don't want them to stop. We want them to ramp up in intensity until the baby is born. Another example would be with blood clotting. So once your platelets start to stick to an injured blood vessel area, so it starts to plug or stop that bleeding, plug that leak, we don't want the platelets to go away. We want more platelets to come to the area until we stop that bleeding. We said that living things are going to interact with other organisms and with the physical environment. So at the ecosystem level, each organism is going to interact with other organisms. So you can have predator and prey interactions. You can have different organisms competing for the same mates, the same resources, food, water, habitats. So just depending what it is, these interactions could be beneficial or harmful to one or both organisms. So organisms are also going to continuously interact with the non-living factors of the environment. So like the soil, so the gas, the nutrients in the ecosystem, it's all kind of interconnected in a great circle of life. So this example, we have some sunlight. That's going to be, the energy is going to be harnessed from the sun by the plant. Okay? So animals can eat the leaves and fruit from the plant. And then this elephant is going to get its energy from those leaves and fruits, and then it's going to poop out its waste and return some of those nutrients and things to the soil. So leaves are going to take up carbon dioxide from the air, release oxygen, right? And then the animals are going to breathe in the oxygen and breathe out CO2. Same thing, the leaves can fall, old leaves can fall to the ground, they will decay, decompose, and those minerals and nutrients will be returned to the soil, and then they can be recycled and reused by the plant again. We said each organism interacts continuously with physical factors in the environment, including humans. So humans interact with our environment sometimes with dire consequences. So over the past 150 years, humans have greatly increased our burning of fossil fuels, which releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which is a greenhouse gas that traps in heat in the atmosphere. So this is just one aspect of climate change that can have more far-reaching effects across other ecosystems. So even deforestation, so normally the plants, the trees can take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, but if we cut down all the trees, now we no longer have that resource for sequestering and taking some of that CO2 out of the atmosphere. CO2, excess CO2 in the air can also affect our ocean, so it can dissolve in the oceans, leading to ocean acidification, which can affect marine life, the coral reefs. So everything is kind of interconnected in wildlife ecosystems as well as our own human ecosystems. So we're also noticing over the past few generations that weather and climate patterns are shifting. So wind, precipitation patterns, extreme weather events like hurricanes and droughts and wildfires are occurring more often, it seems like. So, just past year, it seems California is always on fire. So, this is just a map from the past year for all of the wildfires across California. So, as we continue to kind of change the landscape and these habitats deteriorate, plant and animal species are going to have to adapt or die. So, they are trying to adapt by shifting their ranges. We're pushing them out of their normal habitat. But for some, there's nowhere else for them to go. So there's insufficient suitable habitat for a lot of these species. Um, so that's why we're seeing a lot more kind of wild animal species now kind of overlapping with our human settlements. So you can see wild bears right in a suburban neighborhood looking for food because they're getting desperate. So a lot of these species are even populations are shrinking in size or even disappearing and starting to go extinct.